Ready?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second episode of our webinar series, Women Scholars of Orthodox Christianity. My name is Aristotle Papanikolaou. I'm the co-director of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center with my colleague, George Dimokopoulos. I'm also a professor of theology, and I hold the Archbishop Demetrius Chair in Orthodox Theology and Culture in the Theology Department. Today, we have the inimitable Nadieszda Kizenko. Did I do that right, Nadia? I did that right?
Yeah, good, Telly.
So even before we get to the biography and what this webinar is about, I want to ask you something personal. So in Greek, they have, when you have a name, they have these kind of affectionate ones, like when Dimitris are called Dimitraiki. So is the affectionate form of Nadieszda, is it Nadieszda?
No, thank God. Although for some reason people often think it is, and I have no idea where where that floating K comes from. In Russian, people call me Nadia, thank God.
Okay, yeah.
And so in the real world, people call me Nadia.
You're Nadia, I'm Telly. We have these beautiful names, and you became Nadia and I became Telly. So when people think of me, they think of Telly Savalas instead of Aristotle, but I guess that's our destiny. So both are great figures in their own way. So let me get back to the webinar series. Of course, the title, Women Scholars of Orthodox Christianity, I think speaks for itself. Last week we had 2 weeks ago, we had the equally inimitable Susan Ashbrook Harvey. And you could find that webinar on our website. We invite you very much to visit our website, the Orthodox Christian Studies Center, www.fordham.edu/orthodoxy. There you will find that webinar, and you can find other content. You will see our Journal of Orthodox Christian Studies, Public Orthodoxy, of course, our book series, all kinds of other seminars and conferences and things that we do there. So we very much invite you to visit that website and to also spread the word. And of course, I did mention Public Orthodoxy, which is www.publicorthodoxy.org. We invite you to visit that website as well. And this webinar series, we hope to continue even after this. And we invite you to ask questions. So those of you who are participating, there should be a Q&A kind of prompt somewhere on your screen. Nadia and I hope to kind of chat for about a half hour or so, and then I will be able to look at your questions and to kind of throw a few questions to Nadia. So let me of course begin by reading Nadia's bio, which doesn't really reflect the impressiveness of her career, her scholarship, all that she's done. But Nadia is professor of history at the University of Albany, SUNY. After graduating from Harvard University, a Michael C. Rockefeller Fellowship allowed her to carry out her fantasy of spending all of Great Lent in a monastery. Attending daily services in Gethsemane from the beginning of the Lenten Triodion to the end of the Pentecostarion confirmed her identity as a liturgics nerd. Professor Kizenko was one of the first scholars after 1917 to research Orthodox Christianity in the Russian Empire. Her first book, A Prodigal Saint, Father John of Kronstadt and the Russian People, won the Helt Prize from the Association of Women in Slavic Studies. She writes extensively on topics related to Orthodoxy in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the diasporas. She agreed to appear in this program when she could finally say that her history of confession in the Russian Empire from the 17th century to 1917 was finished and is now in production at Oxford University Press. Yep. I wish I had that woohoo bitmoji that I could flash on the screen, but unfortunately I don't. But yeah, so we're going to get to that. We're definitely going to get to that book in just a few minutes. But let's continue, Nadia, with the personal, right? I asked you about the name and everything. Let's continue with the personal. Let's just tell us a little bit about yourself. I mean, where did you grow up? Your life in the church, all that kind of stuff.
Well, I was born in the Bronx, and my family moved when I was 40 days old, very biblical, to Syracuse, New York. From there, we moved to Flint, Michigan. from there to Hartford, Connecticut, prompting one of my brothers to say that our family had a genius for leaving a place just before it went really downhill. And then after Hartford, Connecticut, my family moved to Vinewood, New Jersey, and from there to Jackson, New Jersey, where my mother still lives. At that point, I was already at Harvard and then New York, and yeah.
So you're a daughter of a priest.
Yes. And by the way, let me just add that the reason that we moved around so often is that unlike the Greek church, where I gather priests make enough to be able to have only one job, in the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, they get almost no money at all. So most priests have so-called real jobs, like they have, which is to say they teach French in high schools, they're engineers, etc. And my dad was one of the only ones who didn't have a so-called real job, but who only did Shakespearean things for a living. So, which is to say, he worked as a gravedigger, he worked as a candle maker. Essentially, anything he ever did was something that you could find somewhere in Shakespeare. And that is what made him somehow portable, so that we could be picked up and asked to move anytime there was a parish opening and there was no other priest who was flexible enough to be able to move there.
And being the daughter of a priest, I mean, I'm son of a priest. We're both, as they call it, PKs, priest kids.
Secret handshake.
I mean, did that play a role in sort of where you are today?
Well, Tully, did it play a role in where you are today? I mean, I would say, Tully, like one of the biggest differences between me and you is that you had the option of doing what your old man did for a living. And I also thought that what my dad was doing was great. I wanted to do exactly what he did, but alas, for me, that was not an option. So I started thinking of what would be the closest way that I could approximate my dad's job. And something occurred to me when I was a senior in South Catholic High School, and we were in Hartford, Connecticut. We were reading Brothers Karamazov, and the teacher had the bright idea of saying, oh, okay, liturgical context in this novel is very important. And we happen to have a Russian Orthodox church literally right around the corner. And one of our students has a father who is the pastor of that church. Maybe we could make a little field trip by strolling over during class and having Nadia say a few words. And I talked to my dad about it. He was very enthusiastic, and he actually, so, like he got to work and he set up the lectern where he normally preached. So he put it in the middle of the ambo and stuff. And so I got up there, and it was great because like there I am in front of the royal doors, looking out at the people. And I thought, okay, I like this. And that was actually that was actually a bit of a sign that in fact going into academia is probably the best way to approximate the clerical ministry, and that you also wear black robes sometimes, you also process in rows of two, sometimes you can preach to the people, sometimes you do a little bit of counseling, sometimes, and most important, to paraphrase the apostle, you get to speak as one having authority, right? Which is very enjoyable.
Well, I mean, this is really interesting because we have different, in many ways, gendered experiences, because I also wanted to become a priest. That was my original path.
So what's stopping you, Talia?
Well, no, I mean, well, you're right. But the interesting thing was that I kind of thought to myself at some point, like, maybe I don't really want to do that. How can I, so that, but I still love theology, but your path is a little different. Like, maybe I really want to do that, but I can't. So why don't I kind of go into the academic route? But yeah.
Yeah, but it's interesting also because it's not just a matter of, is this door closed or is this open? There's also, like, I'm actually really curious to hear from you what Greek practice is, because in Russian Orthodox practice, when a child gets baptized, so like everyone who's not connected to the baptism is just like standing around in the back. Yes, I know you guys sit, but what can I say? So we're all standing around. And if people don't happen to know who it is that's being baptized, everyone always turns and says to one another, is it a boy or a girl? Is it a boy or a girl? It's this little tiny kid. And someone, usually a guy, says with this little smile, well, I guess we'll find out soon enough. And what they mean by that is that at a certain key moment, the girl baby gets placed on the floor in front of the altar. And the boy baby gets carried triumphantly aloft around like behind the altar, around the altar table and out. And so
like Lion King and like Simba and Lion King.
Exactly. So essentially it becomes very clear to you from an early age. So am I going to be on the floor behind, like, and looking at that which I can never ever enter, or am I going to enter it in glory?
Yeah.
Just asking for a friend.
Right. Yeah. I don't remember that experience, but I mean, but in the Greek practice anyway, it is a little bit different actually. The thing that we have, which maybe is in the Russian practice, is whether the boy or girl babies can ultimately, the infants actually can go in the altar in the 40-day blessing or not. But that's probably a common practice. So let's get to the academic stuff now.
Okay.
So, but to tell us a little bit about how your life in the church, your this sense of wanting to be a priest perhaps and couldn't, your experiences with your father, with other people perhaps. I know you're very good friends with two other wonderful scholars of Orthodox Christianity, Sister Vasa and Vera Shevzov. So how did that affect, as you went into the academy? I mean, did it affect what you studied? How you studied it, how you approached it, what you saw perhaps?
Yeah, and it's really funny because in the 80s, when I was in graduate school, strangely enough, although the United States was supposedly the free world and the Soviet Union was, obviously what it was, nevertheless, the rest of the world basically followed Soviet approaches to doing history, which is to say that in the 80s, almost nobody was studying Orthodox Christianity. Almost nobody was studying religion. Essentially, when they thought about studying Russia, they still thought in Marxist categories, even if they themselves weren't Marxist. So people thought of like the working class. They thought of, the metal workers, but when I was trying to think of a dissertation topic, I was trying to think of a topic where from the get-go, I would know more than the average person. Because there are a lot of smart people out there who could become specialists in anything. And I thought, so what is it that I happen to know more about than the average person? And that something was Orthodox Christianity. Somebody suggested to me actually the topic of my dissertation, and I immediately thought, okay, this is great. Father John of Kronstadt, interesting because he's, someone who is, on the one hand, like good religion, but bad politics in the eyes of Russian liberals, at least. And at that point, I was very fortunate because in 1991, the archives in Russia had just opened up. So it was possible to go and to not just have the archive lady essentially decide what you were going to see, but you actually got to see a list of what they had in the archive, and you yourself could put in your own request. So it was as much as wanting to pick a subject where I already had some general knowledge and the learning curve wouldn't have to be quite so steep.
With St. John of Kronstadt, I mean, and maybe I'm remembering this wrong, but I remember because some of my own work is on religion, democracy, orthodoxy. But I remember seeing flashed my screen or something that he wasn't a big fan of democracy. Do you remember that in your own research? And is that taken out of context, or you did mention not a fan of Russian liberals?
Yeah. I mean, no, certainly not a big fan of democracy, to put it mildly. But like the interesting thing is, like, how they say who's a conservative, a liberal, who's been mugged, that basically until the assassination of Alexander II in 1881, Russian liberals loved Father John of Kronstadt because he was doing all the right things. He was blaming rich people for the situation of the poor. He had this great program of social welfare and social action, and getting people employment, etc. So he was, at least at first, he was all of the things that liberals loved. I mean, the problem is that then revolutionary terrorism started, Alexander II was killed, and then Father John goes, whoa, 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 that, let's not lose sight of things. And then, he blessed the banners of far-right organizations like the Union of the Russian People, and so politically he became associated with very different things.
So as a woman Orthodox scholar,
right?
I mean, can you tell me what you've noticed about Orthodox Christianity? And maybe I didn't phrase that question in the way that
okay.
that perhaps, okay. But like as a woman scholar, I mean, are there things that you notice about Orthodox Christianity that you think you notice because you're a woman? And as an Orthodox woman,
okay.
you think you know this? You have like a sensibility about Orthodox Christianity.
Maybe that. Yeah. Well, for starters, I try to pick topics that everybody will have to read, right? So in other words, I know someone who is a wonderful scholar, a man who is writing a history of a convent in Nizhny Novgorod. It's a great book. I've read selections of it. It's fantastic. But like, I didn't want to write about things like convents initially because I didn't want people saying, oh, okay, a woman is writing about women. And there's obviously nothing wrong with that. And I do as well. But I wanted to pick topics like Father John of Kronstadt or confession, where women had to be written into the story and couldn't be written out of the story. And I suppose that if I have a mission in life, it's to have people like look at confession and say, okay, we cannot tell this story by only looking at men, right? Because men make up only half the population. They go to confession at different rates. They confess in different ways. So in other words, if you look at, I mean, to be really basic about it, for many, many topics, in fact, most topics concerning religion, if you look at only one sex, you're leaving out a large part of the equation. And in my case, it happens to be that the sex that has tended to be neglected is women as opposed to men. So in that sense, I see what I'm doing as writing women back into the story, just in ways that it just never occurred to people to look before.
Do you think your experience as a woman and as an Orthodox maybe allows you to see some things in Orthodox Christianity that might be missed by?
Yeah, I think, all right, like, let's say, for example, if somebody were to look at the literary context of confession, they would say, oh, Tolstoy wrote about confession, Dostoevsky wrote about confession, Pushkin wrote about confession, Chekhov wrote about confession. And that's true, but it would never occur to them to say, and what about those written confessions that women were writing? What about those guides to confession that women were writing for their kids? I mean, in other words, the study of literature itself, fortunately, has changed to accommodate a wide variety of genres and so-called forgotten writers. So that helps. But I would say, actually, the thing that probably helps the most is knowing liturgy and having an awareness of liturgy. And because so much, not just of what happens in church, but why people did things when, it's intuitively obvious to someone who has grown up in Orthodoxy. But the problem is that it's so obvious that it actually doesn't occur to us to explain it. And that's actually why, for example, in the confession book, I actually took as my model the work that someone recently did on the Crusades, which begins with, like, before the introduction, there's a section called The Liturgy of Crusading and Its Books, right? So in other words, that people need to know what the basic texts are that we're talking about. That, you know, it's easy for you and me to say, oh, the Lenten Triodion or the Pentecostarian. The average person in reading a book is going to say, okay, and what is the Triodion?
Yeah.
You know,
so it can actually kind of work both ways. I mean, you can kind of, you sort of have a sensibility where you kind of know what that's about,
right.
and maybe kind of get it more immediately, but it also can maybe cause you to take it for granted and maybe look over it as well.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
It's kind of both ways. Yeah. So let's stay on sort of this, your work on women, and also your work on confession, because you recently wrote an article and actually received the award, a best article for the Association for the Study of Eastern Christianity. And the title of the article is, I have to remind myself, The Feminization of Patriarchy, Women in Contemporary Russian Orthodoxy. So can you tell us a little bit about this article and, you know, what you discovered about women in contemporary Russian Orthodoxy?
Yeah, that was actually an interesting case, because as I started working on it, I thought to myself, Telly, you and I come from a context where as opposed to academia, where the word patriarchy is positive and the word iconoclasm is negative.
I know. I've always thought that about iconoclasm. I always think to myself, why is that a good word? I don't understand.
Right. Exactly. And so that article, I don't normally go into the present very much. Normally, I tended to, and at least partly because if you're dealing with people who are safely dead, you don't have to worry about them getting mad at you and how you've used, you know, anything really. But in this particular case, the connection to what I was working on was so strong that I thought it would be necessary for people who are normally work on feminism and know very little about either Russia or about religious women in Russia. And so the challenge there was writing for an audience for whom the patriarchy is very definitely bad. And so then the question is, I mean, it's actually part of another very important trend in scholarship in the last 20 years, which is to say, to look at women in conservative religious contexts. It can be, I'm thinking of books like Ayala Fader's Mitzvah Girls, growing up as a Hasidic girl, as a Hasidic Orthodox girl in Brooklyn.
Yeah, I was at Fordham University. Let me just kind of put that plug in as well.
All right. And the women aglow movement and so on. In other words, I'm very glad that the academic world has finally realized that women who, for whatever reason, are in patriarchal religions, why are they there? What is it doing for them? And in the present context, and in my case, I was interested in the Russian context, is the presence of women changing things in any way, given the revival after the 1990s? Is this a different kind of women's presence than what one had before 1917? And I think the most important aspect of that is the amount of women in Russia who are in religious publishing, who edit Orthodox websites, who edit Orthodox journals. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit too early to tell now still, but I actually really wonder whether and how this will change the way that people both write about Orthodoxy and the way that they also read it, because it's automatically funneled through a slightly different sensibility than what one would have.
It must be a kind of an ongoing fluid situation as well in terms of.
Yeah.
So let's go now a little bit to the book that you finished, which allowed you to give yourself permission to come on with us. But let me remind everybody who's participating as well, please submit your questions. We'll be getting to that portion of the program very, very soon. So we invite you in the Q&A feature, I guess, of this Zoom chat for you to submit your questions. And I'll be able to kind of look at those over here and kind of offer them to Nadia for reflection. But so the book that you finished is entitled and published with Oxford University Press, Confess All, Forgetting Nothing.
That part is still open to discussion.
Oh, I like that. Confess all, forgetting nothing, because, you know, this forgive and forget relates a little bit to this forgive and forget thing. Maybe, I'm not sure, but anyway. But
Telly, I guess we'll go to confession.
There is no forgetting, I think. That's the thing. I mean, so that's why I like the title so much. But
right.
So so let me start again, because confess all, forgetting nothing, church, state, society, and the sacrament of penance in the Russian Empire from the 17th century to 1917.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So tell us about the book. I mean, why did you get interested in the topic?
Okay.
What did you discover along the way? I mean,
Yep.
Tell us a little bit about it. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the book started when I was working on Father John of Kronstadt, and I came across these amazing written confessions to him, mostly by women, and a lot by women who were barely literate. And I immediately understood that this was a gold mine, and actually had a chapter of my dissertation devoted to this. But one of my colleagues, John Manfasani, fortunately said to me, you know what, this is too good to go into the book, i.e. the book about John of Kronstadt. He said, and what do we really know about confession in Russian Orthodoxy anyway? And as soon as he asked me that, I thought, you know what, actually not very much. And what I had initially had in mind as translating these amazing written confessions, and some of them actually I have translated, and they appear in various source books. But so what was going to be a translation of, you know, these hot confessions with an introduction and extensive annotations, instead I thought, okay, to make sense of these things, we actually have to have some idea of how confession in Russia worked. And what I was pushing back against was the association that everybody now has with the so-called synodal period in Russian history, which is to say, like, the version that's in everyone's heads is, you know, bad Peter the Great and bad Feofan Prokopovich eliminated the office of the Patriarch, created the Holy Synod, the Russian Church becomes the handmaiden of the state, blah, blah, blah. And so I wanted to push back against that a little bit, and thought, like, okay, that's what everyone thinks. What can we, like, can looking at confession help us to understand it differently? And especially because what Peter the Great is notorious, the supplement to the spiritual regulation, there's a little section that says that the priest, if someone says anything treasonous at confession, and by the way, a little sidebar, if you were involved in a plot to kill the Tsar, why would you confess it at confession? But anyway, that's a separate moment. If you as a priest learned something potentially treasonous, you should dissuade the person from carrying out this treasonous attempt. And if you couldn't dissuade them to do it, then not only should you not give them absolution, but you should then turn that person into the authorities. And so after that, you know, and the crowd goes wild, right? Because after that, it's, you know, oh, Russia breaking the seal of the confessional, blah, blah, blah. And so I also wanted to see how that actually played itself out, because people very often make the mistake of saying, well, and this is people, I guess, who come from the United States or Germany or somewhere, like, well, I guess if it's a law, that means it goes into practice. And I think to myself, okay, I guess you don't know much about Imperial Russia, because just because something is on the books doesn't mean that it actually goes into effect, and it might go into effect into a very different way. So essentially, what started out wanting to be a way of looking at how people went to confession, what was on their minds when they went to confession, these amazing stories that they told when they went to confession. I realized that to be able to talk about that, it's not enough to say, this is what they said and this is what they did. It's like, well, did they have to go to confession? I mean, was there a law that required them to go to confession? Answer, yes. And so essentially, I started looking at the point in Russian history in the 17th century when not only hierarchs thought that it was a good idea for people to go to confession at least once a year, but that czars also got the idea that if people went to confession and communion at least once a year, this would make them not only better Christians, but better subjects. So, I mean, I can go on and on about this, but then maybe you can ask. I mean, you can tell me, okay, go on and on.
I'm just curious to hear what people confessed in terms of some of the some of the documents you went through, and
okay.
So I imagine it's written documents as well, right? I mean, obviously they would.
No, these are written documents,
right.
and in fact,
but they did this, and just something to understand, they did this in lieu of going to the once a year requirement, or they did it in addition? And if they did it in this written form, was it a form of some kind of subversion in relationship to the empire, or was it a way of their own way of feeling like, in fact, they are following the law and they are good citizens, good Orthodox Christians?
Okay, well, all right, there are several different things going on. One is, why did people put their confessions in writing in the first place? Right. Yeah. Because, in fact, written confessions were, strictly speaking, not supposed to happen. In the period that I'm talking about, confessions, I mean, this was, this was before apps for confession, which, by the way, really exist. This was the point at which, for a confession to be real, well, no, I shouldn't say that. The only really acceptable form of confession was what the Roman Catholic Church calls an auricular confession, where one person goes to one priest and you tell your confession to that priest. Basically, it's owning it, right? You have to say, this is what I did. The only exception, written confessions, strictly speaking, were only supposed to be for deaf mutes, for obvious reasons, who would bring it in, and it would be burned in front of them and so on. And so then the question is, so why did written confessions arise? And in this particular case, the ones that I started out with, people would invariably begin with, I'm too ashamed to tell this to my parish priest. In other words, because as you know, in the Orthodox Church, unlike the Roman Catholic Church, we don't have the confessionals, those booths that the Roman Catholic Church introduced after the Council of Trent. Confession is up close and personal. You're there right next to the priest. He puts his arm around you, and then at the end, his stole is over your head. So it's very intimate. And he sees you. He knows who you are. And at the end, he says your name. So obviously, if you have something really bad on your mind and you're talking to your parish priest, like, maybe you don't want him to know. Right. And so people would sometimes put the really bad sins in writing to people like Father John of Kronstadt. Or sometimes they did them as examinations of conscience. In other words, to prepare for a confession. Yeah. To organize your ideas, you get them down. And actually, I've been to one monastery near Kazan in Tatarstan, in the Russian Federation, where they actually require you to bring a written list of sins before you go. So that partly because it forces you to have some idea of what you're going to say and not just like randomly wait for the priest to ask you questions, but also because they have a lot of people coming and it like moves it along a little bit.
And this is actually one of the questions. I mean, why were they, I get a little bit why they were written down, but why were they preserved?
Well, they were preserved, I think, by accident. In this particular case, it was because
lucky for you. Yeah.
Because this wasn't a confession that people physically brought with them. This was a confession that they sent through the mail. And so this basically, so Father John of Kronstadt, he got tens of thousands of letters, actually hundreds of thousands of letters. So these just stayed in his house that was then sealed up. the room where his letters were sealed up by the Synod after he died. And basically, in a way, one of the great friends of someone who works on Orthodoxy in Russia in the imperial period was the Russian Revolution, because the archives of the Synod were entered into the state, which means that now you don't have to go through someone in the church to look at documents. They belong to the state. They're part of the state archive, which makes access to some kinds of things much easier.
Yeah. But in terms of, and this is one of the questions as well, I mean, it doesn't, at least, I mean, there's these issues of confession and control, let's say, within 19th century Russia. Now, it seemed that though, in terms of these written confessions, was that, it doesn't sound like as if it is, but, and this is one of the questions, was it about control though? I mean, was it a way also of controlling women and women's bodies?
Well, yeah, we'll see, but like this is what's so interesting about confession, because Thomas Tentler has written about this in the context of the Roman Catholic Church, which is to say that, like, people think like Michel Foucault, or like, oh, this is this instrument of control, of discipline. And on one level, of course it is, because I mean, yes, the church is trying to is trying to change the way that you behave, right? But on the other hand, this also could be a way for people to tell their own story and to tell their own life story. Because when you think about it, for the average person, there are very few people who were interested in your autobiography. There are very few people who are interested in what's on your mind. Yeah. And at least in theory, this was one of the few opportunities that you got to actually tell your story. And what's so interesting to me is people knew how to confess, right? There were all of these pamphlets telling them, sort of that when you come to confession, this is what you should think about, and so on. So what's really interesting for me when I read written confessions is, to what extent are people internalizing formulas from pamphlets? To what extent are they internalizing texts from the liturgy? Like, for example, they'll quote the Psalms at the same time as they're confessing, and it's like one seamless process. So it's a very interesting both religious and literary problem of voice. Like, how much of it is original? How much of it is formulaic? Can you really tell them apart? Isn't the idea for people to precisely to make the texts their own? Right. And so it's actually incredibly interesting.
Well, as you know, I've done work on confession myself, and
yeah, great article, by the way.
Yeah, one of the things I find interesting. Thank you. So one of the things I find interesting is confession as a form of truth telling, and how the different, the different kinds of truth telling can kind of rebound back on people. So, the fact that you have to confess in front of a person. Right. Yeah, it's pretty terrifying. So the writing down is still a form of truth telling. And I again, I mean, what I find fascinating is people's, people's desire to tell the truth. I mean,
right. Well, yeah. And actually, to pick up on that, do you remember that scene, that episode in the life of Saint Basil, Saint Basil the Great, where a woman is, has been carrying around the sin that she cannot bring herself to confess. And she realizes that she will only be able to do it, like if she writes down her sins and she brings them to the saint and has him read them and absolve them. So basically, essentially, he doesn't want to do it, and they go back and forth. And ultimately, he dies, and no one has read her text. Like confessors, like Saint Basil and this other guy keep sending her back and forth. Saint Basil finally dies, and so she's there at his funeral and says, basically, thanks a lot. What have you done to me? And so she throws the scroll on his bier, and starts telling people in church, this is what I wanted him to do, and he wouldn't do it. And this priest with prurient curiosity goes, I wonder what she said, So he like opens up the scroll and sees to his amazement that there's nothing on there, right? It's blank. but the interesting thing is like, so what does that tell us? It tells us that writing things down is okay, but she actually manages to avoid confessing her sin to like a person. So it's actually I mean, and this is also there as well.
It also brings some issues up in terms of the person who hears it too. I wonder what it was like for St. John of Kronstadt to get thousands of letters. That kind of and kind of sticking with St. John of Kronstadt and various types of confessions. One of the questions here is that I didn't know this, there were mass confessions, mass common confessions, right? A form of general confession. And actually the question is, were there mass confessions? So that's actually a question. And then the second one, I guess it's not really directly related to the confession, but just simply, if you can answer this very quickly, if you know if there were communication between St. John of Kronstadt and Soloviev, Vladimir Soloviev. So
to answer the second one, not as far as I know. I never saw anything like it, but it's possible. The general confession is really interesting because it started to become, it existed before St. John of Kronstadt in the sense that on like occasionally before battle, for example, they had some form of this. But what's especially interesting is that it's kind of like the Confiator in the Roman Catholic Church, which is to say that there is that the priest who's carrying out such a general confession reads several prayers from the standard beginning of the rite to confession, disposing people to penance. Then he might read a long list of sins and people stand there, quietly repenting for them and so on. And then at the end, everyone goes up to communion without having confessed individually. And this actually became, this actually was a surprise to me. This actually became a thing during the First World War, not only at the front, which, okay, but it started to become more, I'm not going to say widespread, but experimented with already in the years 1914, 1915, 1960s. I mean, no less a person than Tatiana, the Grand Duchess Tatiana, one of the daughters of Nicholas II, wrote to her father saying, "Oh, we had general confession today. I loved it," right? So it was already appearing on the horizon. And a really interesting moment is, of course, after Nicholas II abdicates and they stop assigning penances as routine components of criminal sentences. So, there's like a double blank. You serve this much time in jail and this is how long your penance lasts. It's a really interesting question. Like, what happens when the church-state machine falls apart, right? And what then will people do? And essentially, people started voting with their feet. And one of the things that the church figured out very quickly was that many, I'm not saying everybody, but that many people wanted this practice of a so-called general confession before communion, as opposed to having to do the Russian thing of Gavenia, where you fast for a few days, you go to church for a few days, and then it ends with your going to confession and communion. So it's, yeah.
And now just two more questions on this, on confession, and then so how do you know that women wrote the confessions? Did they sign them, right? And would Father John have written back? And related, I guess, so there's a series of questions here. What would absolution have looked like for these confessions? And if I may ask too, my own, because this is not necessarily part of the question that was that I'm conveying to you, but you never really gave us an example of some of the things being confessed, or maybe I missed that part. I was sort of zooming out, so to speak. But I mean, what were some of the things being confessed that people were so afraid to be able to tell in person?
Tally, what's the rating on this program?
No, I don't know actually.
All right.
So find a way to kind of allude to things. I mean, yeah. So.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you something that's really out there. Fornicated with an insect.
Oh, that's definitely out there. Yeah.
It is out there. It is out there. And I'll tell you honestly, like when I read that, I started thinking to myself, how? Like, I want to know how.
Right.
And then and so then it, it turned into sort of endless conversations. But I mean, it's the sort of thing that one would expect.
It's the strange. Maybe one of the problems is that we don't give space to people to speak the strange, right? That we're afraid ultimately of what people will think, and people have need to think. A lot of strange thoughts cross people's minds, not they will them to happen.
Yeah. I mean that for example, there is what we often forget, because most of us are city people, right? even if we don't physically live in a city, most of us don't work on farms. At least most of us in academia don't work on farms. And so
and the isolation too, I would imagine, in certain areas of Russia. But that might
so just that we forget what rural life was like. So for example, for the average person now, bestiality is not going to be a thing, because simply, just having access to animals, etc. But the more interesting thing to me was sins that to me seem to be specific to the Orthodox. So that, for example, someone will write and saying, when I'm looking at the icons, I have like the wrong ideas enter into my head. And so again, and you think like, okay, people are spending a lot of time in church. They're looking at icons, right? And so ideas enter into their minds. Someone once, and then in this case, it was a man who wrote to Father John of Kronstadt saying, under the influence of Tolstoy, I destroyed photographs of you, like I used a hammer, and I pounded into them, things like that.
Wow. Interesting too. And in terms of knowing,
that's right.
Were they signed, or were they anonymous?
They are almost always signed, but even if they're not signed, because Russian is declined, that if people are writing about themselves, if you're a woman, you're going to use a feminine ending.
Oh, okay, yeah. And were there responses? From Father John and others as well?
No, because obviously, because the responses, if they got any responses, they would have kept them themselves. Like he didn't keep copies of what he wrote, so we only have theirs, which is actually very unusual, because most of the time, women did confess to famous hierarchs and famous spiritual elders in writing, but in those cases, what we have only are the responses. And we don't have what the women actually wrote. So this is actually very unusual in having the confession and not the response to the confession.
Yeah. So we're nearing a little bit towards the end. I want to make sure I get this question in. So it begins with a comment and then an interesting question that maybe ties together, our, the beginning and end, let's say, of our webinar here. It says, I appreciate the discussion about the connection between the professoriate and the clergy. It reminds me of the origins of the university. Residential colleges in Oxford and Cambridge still define the mental care of students as pastoral care.
Yeah.
So do you see your teaching, maybe connected specifically to confession, as pastoral care? Is there a spiritual dimension of your teaching? Has maybe what you've done in confession spilled into the classroom and made you see your role as different, or something like that?
Yeah, well, yes. And also, though, if there's one thing that I inherited from my father, or would like to think that I inherited from my father, it is, or that if I think about the mission of the priest and the mission of the good instructor, it is, one does have to be open to everyone, and one has to meet people exactly where they are. And in my case, I think it's very important for students to have the possibility of writing journals as part of their as part of their assignments, because I have a certain amount of students who would probably fairly be described as being on the far right. And the idea that's in all of their heads is, oh, well, there are things that, the university is this like bastion of liberalism, and there are things that, that they can't discuss. And I actually think it's very important to make sure that everyone in a classroom, or in their journals, and usually they feel more secure putting things in their journals, that they have to be able to float ideas to an instructor and not automatically be shot down or dismissed. I mean, so far I haven't gotten anything that's, that would be just completely off the charts, like let's say white supremacists. I mean, like that would really be obviously an extremely difficult area that one would have to approach more firmly. But I mean that it's important for there to be a give and take of just about every possible idea, and you have to meet people where they are.
Yeah, so in many ways, the classroom could be a space where, what's running through people's minds is able to be expressed in some way.
Well, yeah, I mean, and actually,
itself doesn't necessarily mean condoning.
Right.
One view, the particular view itself. Yeah. Although there is in our culture today, a sense of worry that the very expression itself is somehow something that either is either condones or allows for a certain momentum to build about the discourse itself, I guess. And I guess that's a legitimate fear, I would imagine.
Yeah, but one of my colleagues was really surprised when she asked her classroom, when was the last time that you had a conversation with someone with whom you disagreed?
Yeah.
And they couldn't think of any. They could not think of a single time when they had had a conversation with someone with whom they disagreed. And that, I think, is also really important. And that's something that we need to do as instructors, which is to say, basically to be able to train people in how to have a conversation in which different ideas are expressed.
Right.
Yeah.
So no, it's a tough issue again, because we don't necessarily control thoughts that we notice running through our mind. We don't necessarily control the kinds of impulses that we notice ourselves having. We don't necessarily control, we don't necessarily will what it is that we think is persuasive. And, it's an interesting conundrum to some extent, because in totalitarian regimes, to go to the other extreme, what you have is an extreme policing of confession, in the sense of you don't even know whether to trust your uncle or your brother or your father. And I can't even imagine living in a society where you can't really speak the truth to anyone, because you're simply not sure how that's going to get reported back. But that would highlight maybe even more the importance of these kinds of written confessions that you kind of noticed and discovered and exist in 19th century Russia, because if no one actually finds these, they're still a form of speaking the truth somehow, of the human desire to speak the truth. It's a very complicated issue, especially in the political world we live in, and it obviously has political implications too. But I definitely see how the classroom can be, rightly navigated. It can be a space in which what's running through people's minds simply has a way of being expressed.
No, I actually will say that one of the things that I find very touching about my students is that they try not to hurt other people's feelings. In other words, in fact, probably the bigger issue is that they genuinely don't want to hurt or offend someone. And that's actually, they're more willing to go out on a limb somehow in texts that they submit privately, but in public they've internalized the idea that one should be respectful. And I actually think that although I suppose anything could be carried too far, I actually think that that's a nice element of discourse. Now, what we have to try to do is to say you can be respectful, but you can also disagree. And in fact, civil society is about being able to have a conversation with someone with whom you disagree.
Right. So, I mean, I think there's a sense in which when we think about confession, we think about it within the religious realm. People mostly think about the Catholic and Orthodox worlds because it's a so-called, it's a sacrament, not so-called, it is a sacrament, and we can talk about what that means, but it's a sacrament. But it obviously has these wider cultural, civil kind of implications. Truth-telling, confession in general, I mean, it obviously has those broader ramifications. So I see your work ultimately kind of moving, perhaps making us think about some of those questions as well. So, well, you and I can go on and on and on as we have at conferences and when we've gotten together for lunch and other things. And I'm looking forward to that happening again, hopefully one day soon. Let me, before we sort of wrap up, this is the second, everyone, in our webinar series. The third one, the third episode in our series of women scholars of Orthodox Christianity will be on Wednesday, June 24th at 11 a.m. So we've had different times. Please take note of that. We had one in the afternoon. This one was at noon Eastern time. The next one on June 24th, Wednesday, will occur at 11 a.m. Eastern time. And we will have again, the inimitable Dame Avril Cameron of Oxford University, who's very well known to everyone. She needs really no introduction at all. And so we're looking forward to that as well. And so, Nadieszda, thank you very much. This has been a joy. And again, we can go on and on and on to talk about all these wonderful things and the great scholarship and the great contribution that you're doing, both to the Academy and to the Church. And so we thank you.
Thank you, Telly.
And everyone, thank you for joining us. We hope you will join us again. I just want to make sure that I'm not missing a note from somebody at Fordham telling me I need to do something before we sign off. But again, thank you, everyone. Stay healthy, stay safe. And again, please visit.
Stay negative.
What's that?
Stay negative.
Stay negative. That's a good way to put it. Kind of apophatic. Stay apophatic. Right? So
I meant in terms of health, but okay.
Right. Well, it's So managing a theological spin to it, I guess. So, and please do check out our website, fordham.edu/orthodoxy and publicorthodoxy.org, and all our wonderful content. And we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time. So thank you, Nadia.
Thanks, Telly.
See you
Bye.
later. Bye-bye.